Welcome, everybody, to the Mana Vault podcast, where we tap for 3, put our magic opinions on the table, and you decide if it's worth it to take 1 on your upkeep. I'm your host. My name is JC, and joining me as always, I have Arven. Arven, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Good. We are back for episode 2. Arven, let's get into our announcements. What do you got for us?
So actually, if you are looking to support our show, either here or on YouTube, you can always find us at patreon.com/themanavaultyt. And also, if you haven't heard, we are going to Vegas. Some of the Mana Vault crew is coming to, it's not GP Las Vegas, but it's just called GP Las Vegas for the time being. And if you want to come support us there, come hang out with us. We'll be there and we'll talk to you then.
Yeah, I think the running title is MTG Vegas.
I think so, yes.
Mid-November, if you want to see some of the Mana Vault crew, they're going to be there.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely. We'll be like rocking some of the Mana Vault merch, some of our, shirts and whatnot. Come say hi.
Yep, absolutely. All right, let's jump into our opening segment. What card do?
I see.
So today, we're talking about a pretty recent card. In fact, the most recent set, short of our upcoming Crimson Vow.
Yeah.
This card's from Midnight Hunt. It's called Sunset Revelry. 1 and a white for a sorcery. If an opponent has more life than you, you gain 4 life. If an opponent has more creatures than you, create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens. And if an opponent has more cards in hand than you, draw a card.
So this is kind of in mentions to another card. Do you want to tell us about the other card that was sort of similar to it?
Yeah, for a while now, as a kind of a modern sideboard card, we've had Timely Reinforcements, which is 2 and a white for a sorcery. If an opponent has more life than you, you gain 6 life, and if they have more creatures, you create 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. This was a sideboard card you would bring in against decks like Burn in particular, because you would always be at a lower life and you would just want to make them work the extra 2 bolts to finish you off. Also, if you were a control deck especially, they would have Goblin Guides and Monastery Swift Spears running around. Eidolons. You would get those 3 1/1s, and you just get some free chump blockers. That actually saves you a good amount of damage against Burn.
Oh, absolutely. So also the other thing is, at the time, there was humans running around, so sometimes you just need a little bit of extra life, and you do need some, like, blockers on the ground until you get to, like, your big splashy spells that wipe the board, or just something that keeps you in the game and keeps going for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would even have seen this brought in against Infect, just because if it's not Blighted Agent, you just wanted to have a body that you could throw under the bus. Infect doesn't play a ton of trample effects. They just play a lot of things that make their creature very big and then, run you over that way. But if you just have a 1/1, you're like, okay, feed 1 to the machine, feed another one.
You have more time. Life doesn't really matter with Infect, but you have time in those creatures. But like you said, a lot of times just one thing that's coming in for 10 or more Infect that wants to kill you as quickly as possible.
Yep. There have been times where certain decks in Modern would play Timely Reinforcements in the main, maybe a couple extra on the side or something like that. But nowadays, we see it primarily as a sideboard card, and Sunset Revelry, the new one, has been popping up a little more because so you're trading down 2 life and 1 creature, but you have the potential to draw an extra card if you're down on cards from your opponent, and it costs 1 less mana.
Oh, absolutely, which is huge in those kinds of games.
Coming in on turn 2 is a big deal, especially with threats like Ragavan and Darcy running around.
And also, that card draw, it essentially it replaces itself, which is insane, especially in, like, control-style decks, where you just want more cards, more options. A lot of times in Modern, what you see, or what I personally see, is you just want more card options than card quality, unlike some other decks like Tron. They don't care about, quantity, they just care about quality.
You and I were playing last night at the time of recording, and I had a game where I got to play both of these in one turn and gain 8 life and just keep myself off of the... you were playing Yawgmoth combo, so I could die at any time, but the fair game plan of just attacking me... That put me back up to like 19 life or something like that.
It did. The fair game of me attacking you does not work anymore, and I was at a lower life total, so I needed a lot of work for me to just to kill you.
And even the game where I only got to play 1 of them, I got 2 creatures and a card draw. Felt pretty good.
Oh yeah,
for
absolutely.
2 mana?
It's very strong.
Yeah.
But with that being said, what's our main topic here, JC?
So we talked last week about a bunch of the different decks in Modern and the archetypes in Modern. So we want to talk today about how do you sideboard against those? What is sideboarding just in general?
Oh, absolutely. Modern is different. You have a bunch of different decks running around. Some cards may not make sense in your deck or may even just like counteract what you're trying to do. But if it hurts your opponent more than it hurts you, a lot of times it's just good enough to slow them down so you can try and kill them.
Definitely. Notably, on this segment, we will be talking about a lot of cards specifically for Modern and Legacy.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of overlap with certain cards there. But we will also give you sort of general ideas of how to think about a sideboard, and that can apply to Standard or any format, Pauper or Pioneer, whatever format you might be playing. The principles carry over for thinking about what your opponent could be on and what cards do you want to bring in against those kinds of decks.
Yeah, I agree. The specific cards may not carry on, but the principle, like you said, will carry on. You want to stop combo, you want to stop graveyard. There's multiple different strategies which we'll cover.
Definitely. So what are we going to talk about first?
So I think first we should cover graveyard, because graveyard decks in Modern right now are actually pretty popular with Lurrus as a companion. So there's quite a few different cards that you want to bring in, but it obviously depends on the colors that you're in. So for example, if you're in like a blue-white style deck or any sort of control, you want a card like Rest in Peace, where graveyards just don't exist. The graveyards are gone from the game.
Rest in Peace, so 1 and a white enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards, and then if a card would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead.
Correct. So those Lurrus players that are trying to do some shenanigans with like maybe putting a Ragavan back into play or like a Mishra's Bauble.
Nile Spellbomb.
Anything like that, it doesn't exist anymore. And Living End has a rough time against that because they have very few answers and Breeze and Borrow.
Having to fairly cast your creatures in that deck is pretty bad. It also makes cards like Tarmogoyf a lot worse. Cards like Unholy Heat can't get Delirium anymore. Darcy can't Delirium anymore.
And some of the other decks where you want to kind of like playing back on it with Lurrus and Urza Saga.
Yeah.
Because you can keep replaying dumb stuff like that. You can get all the artifacts. You can just keep going. And so there are a few other graveyard cards. What are some of them?
Well, let's talk about Soul Guide Lantern. We'll put into that category as well Relic of Progenitus and Nile Spellbomb. These are 1-mana artifacts that have a 1-shot to exile somebody's graveyard. Tormod Crypt is a 0-drop that does it to somebody as well.
You
put it in the same category.
Get Grafdigger's Cage. Sure, it's a little more specific, but a lot of the times you don't have too many options. If it hurts your strategy, immensely, then you want just that one little thing that stops your opponent seeing a little less play because of Soul Guide Lantern. But it still exists in the format.
Grafdigger's Cage notably stops creatures from entering from graveyards or libraries, and players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. So something I learned the hard way in a Modern game was Grafdigger's Cage does not stop Living End, because Living End exiles the creatures in the graveyard and then puts them into play from exile. It will stop Reanimator strategies, though.
So decks in Legacy, specifically Reanimator, does no longer do anything. If you're casting Grizzlebrand fairly, you're not winning that game anymore.
So Scavenging Ooze is another great example from Modern and Legacy past and present. That one
is a big one.
1 and a green 2/2. Pay a green to exile a card from a graveyard. If that card was a creature, put a 1/1 counter on the Scooz, and you gain a life.
And now, the biggest one that we've gotten that's seeing the most play currently is Endurance. So Endurance is a green, and one other for a 3/4 with Flash.
And Reach.
Which is a lot. And it's also 3 mana. But when it enters the battlefield, target player shuffles all cards in their graveyard into their library. Sure, it doesn't exile them, but if you are against like Living End, for example, them having to restart when they just played a Living End, it's rough. It's really rough.
I believe it's actually, they put them on the bottom in a random order. But the point is that they go back into the library, which if your opponents played a bunch of fetch lands in the early game, they don't want to draw any more fetch lands. That feels awful.
Especially with some decks only play a certain amount of lands, and if your fetch lands say tap, pay 1 life, fail to find, you're in kind of some trouble there.
Also, cards like Thoughtseize really good in the early game. In the late game, it's not the thing you want to top deck when you're facing down lethal.
No, absolutely.
You don't want to just 2 yourself. So Endurance is really great. Notably, this is one of the elementals that you can evoke by exiling a green card from your hand. So evoke means it'll come into play and immediately sacrifice itself.
But a lot of the times, you just need that one shot just to keep you in the game or keep them out of the game.
I've had legacy games where I've actually flashed this in with the evoke cost, allowed it to go to the graveyard, and then put my own graveyard back on the bottom so I don't mill out. And I'm like, yeah, I just put Endurance back in. I have the trick again one more time. So,
which is kind of funny that you bring it up, because mill is a great strategy against mill. Because it's not like a Titan where they mill and you shuffle, they can exile. No, this just, you cast, it enters, you keep going.
Yep. I love it.
Oh yeah.
So that's a lot of the ways that we deal with graveyard decks. There are other cards across various formats, but the idea is these are cards you want to bring in against decks that are trying to play with their own graveyard. Endurance is kind of a weird one where you might also use it to save yourself from a mill deck. But in general, these cards are meant to ruin opponents' decks that want to use their graveyard as a resource. And the older you get in Magic, the more and more common the graveyard as a resource is. Absolutely. And the more powerful it is.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just even in like sideboard style like formats. It's the older you said like you get in Magic, your graveyard is a lot of times just your second hand.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's even more powerful than your hand, like with Vintage and Legacy Dredge decks.
Absolutely.
You care more about what's in your graveyard. So
absolutely,
being able to hate those out is huge, and you need that in your sideboard.
So we did cover graveyard a little heavily, but because graveyard is such a popular thing, it exists everywhere, no matter what format.
Yeah, multiple archetypes, multiple different decks in each archetype. Your graveyard used as a resource is a very common characteristic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do you think our next topic should be?
Well, why don't we talk about combo? Let's talk about dealing with combo decks.
Absolutely. So combo is a weird one, right? There are some combos that go infinite, or there are just some that are it's just value engine that keeps going and going. It may not seem like infinite, but your opponent gets to be so far ahead either in mana or life or cards, whatever it is, that you just feel like the game is over. And how you really stop that are interactive cards, usually in like Thoughtseize.
Yep.
So Thoughtseize, 1 black, it's sorcery. Target opponent reveals it's actually target player, so you can target yourself. Reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from among them, that player discards that card, and you lose 2 life.
Yep.
So if you are against like a Living End style deck, because like that's sort of a combo deck, you can take any of their Cascade stuff, and now they have to
Shardless Agent, Violent Outburst. Yep.
And another one would be like Force of Negation. Force of Negation is a really good one. So Force of Negation is blue, and 1 of anything. It says counter target non-creature spell. Has another line of text where it says counter target non-creature spell, also says exile that card. And if it's not your turn, you may cast the spell without paying its mana cost by exiling a blue card from your hand.
Yep.
Which is insane.
Yep.
Oh, man.
Again, talking about graveyard decks earlier, sometimes you countering a spell with straight up counterspell, disallow, cancel, whatever your counterspell of choice might be, depending on format, force of will.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because it might still be available to them in the graveyard. I mean, like if they have a Lurrus in play and you counter Tarmogoyf, okay, I will cast it from my graveyard.
Yeah.
But if they're playing with, let's say they're playing with Mishra's Bauble, and you force negation that, I wouldn't normally recommend that, but if you're trying to shut them off of a value engine, yeah, it goes into exile and they don't have it for their Lurrus anymore.
Correct. Which is so strong in these kinds of decks, especially with like Lurrus honestly seen play in just every format it's legal in, because it's so powerful.
Yeah. A lot of combos also will take advantage of certain activated abilities. I'm specifically thinking of like the Devoted Druid Vizier combo in Heliod decks. And the way you shut that off is you play Pithing Needle, name a card, its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. You can't untap the Devoted Druid. Sorcerer Spyglass does the same thing. Phyrexian Revoker.
Yeah, there's quite a few cards. It kind of reminds me of the old pod style decks, like Birthing Pod, where they have like a bunch of one-ofs and like silver bullets.
Yep.
So you just get them to the right matchup just so they can stop your opponent from doing what they need.
But if I Pithing Needle your Birthing Pod.
Well, now I'm in trouble.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other card is Chalice of the Void. So Chalice of the Void is a weird one. You do bring it in to stop combo, but Chalice of the Void is more versatile in the sense where if you have the mana, you can put it on anything. So it's XX for an artifact. You can pay, so if you're paying 2, it comes down at 1. So if you can pay as much as you want, and it enters with that many counters on it, and any spell with mana value equal to the number of counters on Chalice of the Void can't be,
gets countered.
Correct. If it says it can't be countered, well, then you're fresh out of luck.
Yeah.
But usually kind of like remnants into like Living End. Living End costs 0 mana. Chalice of the Void on 0 says Living End can no longer be cast. Well, it can, it just will get countered.
Exactly. That's a good way to stop specific cards. That one also just sees play in the main board sometimes in metas where the curve is very low, so you're just trying to hit 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
And then play something that costs more than that.
Absolutely. Like a lot of Tron decks play because they can get up to that big mana, and you can just shut your opponent out of the game entirely.
Exactly. The last category of cards we want to talk about for combo hate would be the search your opponent's library for copies cards. So the most famous of these is probably Surgical Extraction, which is a Phyrexian black for an instant. So you can pay a black or 2 life, choose target card in a graveyard other than a basic land, search its controller's library for any number of copies of that card and exile them, then they shuffle their library. Another example of this is Necromentia. 1 black for a sorcery, choose a card name. So this is one you just pick something even if you it's not in their graveyard or in their hand or anything necessarily. Choose a card name other than a basic land. Search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of copies of that card, and then exile them. They shuffle their library. Then they create a 2/2 black zombie for each card that was exiled from their hand this way, giving them a little bit of value back for losing a combo piece from their hand that way.
Like, it's very powerful. So the differences between these two is Surgical is 1 mana, well, technically 2 life.
And instant speed.
And it does just hit something. This one is 3, which is why you can choose any card.
But you don't have to see it in the graveyard or know that it's in their hand or anything like that. It just, I'm naming this and this is the card I need you to not have ever again for the rest of the game.
So for like example, if they're on like regular Tron, you can name any of the
Urza's Tower and call it good. Yeah,
and then that's gone forever.
They're never getting Tron. They might get to 7 lands or something, but they're never getting Tron as a combination of lands.
Absolutely. There are a few other like fringe cards that some decks play, but those are specific for each decks. Like there are some decks that play Meddling Mage where it enters and name the card and that card can't be cast.
Yep.
There are some very like fringe cards like that, but those are like the big ones that encompass, modern legacy and decks and formats like so.
And again, combo is such a diverse archetype because combos can look like any number of different things. Some combos involve creatures, some combos involve spells interacting with each other, some combos involve non-creature permanents interacting with each other, some combos just involve lands.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to plan for different combo decks with different cards. So it's, as with any sideboarding, it's about knowing your meta and saying, okay, I know that there are going to be players who are playing these decks, so what cards can I put in my sideboard to prepare for that?
Absolutely. That kind of brings it to, like, if you're going to, like, your local LGS, right, and you know your meta is, like, Tron heavy, maybe tech your sideboard against a little more against Tron, or if you know it's Mill heavy, then, sideboard accordingly.
Yeah.
If you're going to, like, a large event, you want to have a little bit of everything because it's such a diverse meta with, like, maybe 2,000 people, the odds of you running to the same deck every game are
very unlikely.
Yeah.
Unless the meta's unhealthy, but
right.
Currently that's not the case, thankfully.
Oh, yeah.
Well, since we're talking about hating on lands, why don't we talk about a little bit of land hate? This is going to be for decks that play lands with very special activated abilities or triggered abilities, whatever it might be, or decks that play 3+ colors.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the big ones that has been seeing play in Modern for a long time, and you're gonna love this one,
This is my least favorite card in Magic.
It's called Blood Moon.
Oh, yeah.
Blood Moon is an enchantment for 1 red, 2 others, and it says non-basic lands are mountains. Period.
Now, some people are going to get this confused with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, which says lands are swamps in addition to their other types.
No, this one says they are mountains.
Is a mountain.
Period.
Loses all other abilities, loses all other types, or subtypes, excuse me.
Yes.
It does not lose types or super types.
Correct. Those still stick around.
Yeah.
But,
So notably, if you have a Darksteel Citadel, it is still an artifact.
yes.
And if you have a snow-covered, one of the snow duels from Kaldheim, it's still a snowland.
Yes. The one thing of note is if a like let's just say you have a fetch land, that fetch land says tap, add 1 red. That's it.
That's it.
That's all it says.
That's all it does.
And those kind of hurt decks like Tron, for example.
Tron's a big one. Amulet Titan is a big one.
In Legacy, it doesn't see as much play because there are other cards, but it hurts lands.
Yeah.
It's in their name. There are a bunch of lands.
Yep, exactly. In Legacy, we have access to Wasteland, which destroys non-basic lands. That being a land that either taps for mana or gets rid of the land's player's best cards means that we're usually just betting on those kinds of things. But there are other cards we can certainly play on the sideboard to hate on lands.
Oh, absolutely. One of the ones that is just mostly geared towards Tron is Alpine Moon. JC, do you want to tell us what Alpine Moon does?
Yeah, I hate this one too. Alpine Moon is single red for an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose a non-basic land card name. Lands your opponents control with the chosen name lose all land types and abilities, and they gain tap, add 1 mana of any color.
So if I play this and name Urza's Tower, what is Urza's Tower?
Well, notably, the type of Urza's Tower is Urza's Tower.
Right.
So it loses that, which means it doesn't function with the other Tron lands, but also it loses the ability to tap for colorless. It now just has tap, add 1 mana of any color.
So, like, in that case, Tron goes, I see, I'm going to play fair now.
Yeah.
Which is not
Kinda
really
have to.
where you want to be at, but here we are.
Yep.
Also, it's still kind of running around, but in previous years, there was Fulminator Mage, where it could be seen off Coco.
Yeah.
So, Fulminator Mage is a 3-mana, 2 hybrid for a red or a black.
Yep.
When he enters the battlefield, nothing happens. You may sacrifice Fulminator Mage, destroy target land.
Yep.
So for 3 mana, you can just Stone Rain someone.
Yep.
Which is huge.
This was a big card in the sideboards of Jund for a long time because this was their answer to Tron in a lot of ways. Having a 2/2 threat for 3 mana that could go, oh, you found your land combo? All right, now it's gone.
Blowing up.
Or just shutting off.
Absolutely.
Or just shutting off like a specific color and stuff like that. It does notably only hit non-basic lands.
Non-basic lands.
That was what you brought it in for. If you want to get rid of basics, play Ghost Quarter.
Honestly, yeah. Like, that's the thing is, because I'm used to playing the card and I'm used to building up non-basic, so I completely forgot it's just non-basic lands. I'm never usually hitting
in the
basics.
matchups where it was relevant, it hit most of their mana base, so that was all you cared about.
Oh, absolutely. But, like, also with what you mentioned, some of these cards can also just be plain in the main board, like Ghost Quarter. We also have a really good one where you can, if you want to force your opponent to shuffle their deck, it's a really good way in Field of Ruin. So Field of Ruin is pay 2, sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land. Each player must search their library for a basic land. Obviously, you can fail to find, but you must shuffle and put that land into play.
Yep.
Which is phenomenal. And like the older formats, if you are playing this deck and they brainstormed and they have a fetch land, they notably did not crack it.
Yep.
And it's, an option.
Even just scrying.
Oh,
if you watch your opponent, if they cast a Serum Visions and they're like, yeah, I'll leave these 2 on top, you're like, okay, Field of Ruin, I'll kill your Tundra, and you shuffle.
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a different ways that you can, and those are the kind of cards that you can just play in the main board, because if you are not, if your mana base is like 1 color, or like Tron, for example, you don't have any colors, or like maybe some green, you can just play those in the main.
Definitely true.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked about lands, we talked about combo, we talked about
combo, land, and graveyards.
And graveyards, yeah. Why don't we talk about burn?
Burn.
Yeah.
So Burn is its own archetype because burn will exist in some shape, way, or form.
Even if it's not specifically like the red white X deck that you think of from Modern, or the Goblins decks that you think of from Legacy.
Right.
Some form of aggressive deal damage to your face with creatures, even if it's just aggro decks in general that are solely focused on hitting you with creatures. Affinity does this.
Yes.
Humans would do this. Elementals kind of does this, although a little bit slower.
Right.
These decks you need answers to this. You need ways to deal with them. And this is where cards like Sunset Revelry and Timely Reinforcements come in.
I do agree. So like you said, burn isn't always just straight up burn. It's a deck that's going to reduce your life total to 0 as quickly as humanly possible.
And that's the strategy. Even combo decks like Living End, the goal is still, I'm going to hit you for 20 or more over the course of time.
Absolutely. And some of the cards that kind of deal with that, like you said, we have the Sunset, we have Revelry. And we also do have bigger decks that can produce more mana. In Tron, for example, we get Thragtusk.
Yeah, the swag.
Oh yeah, that's see, when it enters, you gain 5 life, and when it dies, it leaves behind a body. So even any variation of these like super aggressive decks, they're going to play some creatures in some shape or another.
Thragtusk is one of the weird ones that's just when it leaves the battlefield, you get a 3/3.
So if you have some way to blink it, you can just keep going.
Oh yeah,
and going and going.
It makes bouncing it with Teferi feel really bad.
Yeah, it does.
Really bad.
And like these kind of strategies are not just burn, for example. Like they can't just be like a bunch of aggro decks. So you have a few different answers in like Engineered Explosives.
Yep.
Engineered Explosives is a powerful card where you can just randomly hit things.
Yep. Single X for an artifact enters with X charge counters, where X is the number of colors spent to cast it. I think at the time it was called Sunburst.
Yes.
Now we see it more as Converge, but and then pay 2 and sacrifice it. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of counters on it. So a lot of decks will even splash a Triome just to have the third color to be able to hit 3 drops if they need to.
Oh,
this does hit 0 drops if you're up against some tokens. A lot of times you're going to see this on 1 or 2, though.
Yes, most aggressive decks are like, for example, actual burn is just going to play their Goblin Guides. They're going to play their Monastery Swiftspear.
Yep.
Those are all just 1. So a lot of times you can just play it on 1 and you should be hopefully dealing with some of the damage.
Yep.
And some of the other cards are cards like Obstinate Baloth, because a lot of times before Luris, Liliana was in the format. Liliana of the Veil. Her
Plus to make you discard a card.
Yep. And if Obstinate Baloth gets discarded, he comes right into play.
Yep. Obstinate Baloth, 2 green for a 4/4. If you would be forced to, if you would discard it, if an opponent would make you discard it, instead put it into play, and then when it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life.
Which is phenomenal, considering you did nothing and you got a 4/4 and you were ahead on, or gained 4 more life. It's really good. It's really good.
Yeah. It's also just, if your opponent's on some sort of make you discard deck, this is really good against that. So 8 Rack is a deck that has existed in Modern before.
Oh, yeah.
Just plays a lot of Thoughtseize effects and the Rack to make you take damage for not having cards in hand. But, I'm going to make you discard Obstinate Baloth. Okay, I gain 4 and I have a 4/4 that smacks you.
Feels real bad.
Yeah.
And like right now, even without Lily, some Jund variations also get Kroxa. So when Kroxa enters the battlefield, target opponent, it's actually each opponent discards a card. And if it's a land card, they lose 3 life. And if it's the last card, they lose 3 life. If you're discarding a Obstinate Baloth, you're going to gain 4 life and put a 4/4 into play.
Correct.
Which is insane. Absolutely
Feels pretty
insane.
okay. Feels pretty okay.
So now, one of the other topics is just sort of removal. It doesn't really have any sort of like direction.
Yeah.
You just want to remove permanents or artifact, whatever you need to remove.
Answers to opponents' threats. So this is something we see more in mid-range and control decks in their sideboards, because I see that my opponent is playing specific card types, or it has specific threats. I want to bring in more cards that answer those specific threats.
Absolutely.
A lot of times when we think about this, we think about artifact and enchantment strategies. So Enchantress, Affinity, that kind of thing. Wurza decks. And, should we discuss Force of Vigor?
Force of Vigor is really powerful.
So from the same cycle as Force of Negation, Force of Vigor is 2 green. If it's not your turn, you may exile a green card rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Destroy up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments.
Oh, that feels so good, especially if you're against like an Enchantress style deck or if you're against Affinity. Some lands are also artifacts, or if you're against, it's not as popular right now, but if you're against a Infect deck and they animate one of their creature lands, this card hits them.
Inkmoth Nexus notably is an artifact creature. It's true.
I like hitting your lands for 0 mana. Sure, I lose a card in the process, but I'm not going to die. So
it's also worth noting that a lot of the hate cards that we're discussing that you bring out of your sideboard are artifacts or enchantments.
Yes, which is kind of interesting.
So bringing this in as kind of a proactive thing to say, oh, you're going to bring in Rest in Peace against me. You're going to bring in, what's it called? You're going to bring in Soul Guide Lantern, or you're going to bring in, you know, in olden days, it would be Leyline of the Void.
Oh, yeah.
No, those go away.
Yeah,
goodbye.
Those do nothing.
Goodbye.
And in Legacy, Leyline of the Void still exists because you play against Dread strategies where you just don't want to lose the game. You're like, there's a Leyline. And kind of to play off of that is some like protection pieces. You do get cards like Veil of Summer, where your opponents who are in blue and black have a little bit of a rougher time dealing with your stuff. You get cards like Dovin's Veto, which is a negate but can't be countered. For a white and a blue, you can counter target non-creature spell. Dovin's Veto says can't be countered.
Yep.
So
since we're talking about uncounterable cards, Abrupt Decay for green and black can't be countered. Destroy target non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less. It's an instant.
Yep, which is phenomenal. And you also, it's falling a little bit out of favor because there's just, Fort Modern's just gone a little bit very quickly, is Assassin's Trophy. It's protection. Their opponents get a basic land into play on tap, but that card removes anything.
At instant speed, any permanent.
Anything that you want.
That your opponent controls. Fatal Push.
Fatal Push is a very
Destroy target creature if its mana value is 2 or less. If you've revolted, meaning a permanent has left you play from your control this turn, it's 4 or less instead. And huge deal for 1 mana at instant speed.
What kind of lands do we have in Modern that like to go to the graveyard pretty often?
Fetch lands.
I see.
We get a lot of fetch into Fatal Push.
And we also, in the blue decks, if they're against in the mirror or anything like that, you get Mystical Disputes.
Yeah.
For 1 blue, well, it's actually 2 and 1 blue, counter target spell unless the controller pays 3.
But if it targets a blue spell, it costs a single blue. It costs 2 less.
Phenomenal.
Huge deal.
It's very, very powerful. And it's, again, falling out a little bit of favor because we have a very powerful card in its place, which JC is going to cover in a second here. But its Path to Exile is sometimes it would come out of the sideboard. It's 1 white for instant speed. Exile target creature. Its opponent searches their library for a basic land, puts it into play tapped.
Yeah.
And why is that card has fallen out of favor?
Well, because nowadays we have Prismatic Ending. Prismatic Ending, single white and X for a sorcery. You can pay any amount of mana into it, but it has converged, so it cares about the number of colors spent on it. Exile target non-land permanent with mana value less than or equal to the number of colors spent to cast this spell. Even though this is a sorcery, this has replaced Path in a lot of the control decks or even the mid-range decks because it hits planeswalkers, it hits enchantments and artifacts. It hits anything that's not a land. Path only hit creatures. I still think Path is pretty good, but this is definitely better.
I do agree. So what I think sort of also took its place is a creature. It's 2 white and 2 of anything. Has lifelink, and it also has Evoke.
It's 3 of anything, actually.
Is it 3 of anything?
Yeah, it's 5 mana.
It's 5 mana?
But Solitude. Solitude is reminiscent of Swords to Plowshares, which is Legacy's Path to Exile. So instead of getting a basic land, your opponent would gain life equal to the creature's power. Solitude is 3 white for a flash lifelink 3/2. It's an elemental. You can evoke it by exiling a white card from your hand, and then when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 other target creature. That creature's controller gains life equal to its power. Again, this kind of replaces Path to Exile because instead of ramping them, they're just gaining some life that in a control deck you just don't care about.
Not at all. And the other thing is, if you have a way to blink this thing, So if it enters, and let's just say you ephemerate, it just comes back and does it again. Or if you can just hard cast it, sometimes it's good enough to just win you the game, or that extra life is just so powerful.
Yep. Remove their one blocker and then attack for 3 the next turn. That's pretty big. Since we're on the topic of some of these cards, we've been talking about Dovin's Veto. We've been talking about Mystical Dispute. These cards are also really good sideboard cards against our next category, which is Control.
Yes.
And we've already talked about Thoughtseize as well. So one of the things Control likes to be able to do is play with a lot of cards in hand, be able to answer 1 for 1, right? You have 1 threat, I answer it with 1 removal spell, 1 counter spell, whatever it might be. Thoughtseize says, no, you're just going to lose one of those cards.
Yep. That's the thing with Control, is Control, a lot of times, like I kind of mentioned, is they want card quantity, not quality, because a lot of their quantity is just the same card with just in different text.
That's how you get the quality, is that the cards are all just very good and all answer as many things as possible.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
and with Control, it's a little weird to deal with them. Or like the whole rock, paper, scissors exists. Like Control is meant to beat mid-range is meant to beat aggro, and aggro is meant to beat Control.
Yeah.
That's kind of like how it is. How you deal with it is aggro, or just you hit their hand, or you just play better counter spells than they do.
That's why, we talked about Veil of Summer. Veil of Summer is single green for an instant. It says that your spells cannot be countered by blue or black spells or abilities this turn. Your permanents have hexproof from blue and black this turn. And if an opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn, you draw a card. So this is green's answer to Control is, I'm going to put this spell on the stack. Okay, I play a counter spell. Veil of Summer. I draw a card, you don't get to counter my thing.
Which is insane, especially because if, like you said, Control wants to do the 1 for 1, but if they're casting the spell and you get to cantrip off of it and your spell gets to resolve, it's almost a 3 for 1.
Yep.
Which is in your favor, not in the Control deck's favor.
If they Thoughtseize you get to play this and go, okay, not only am I not going to lose a card, but I'm going to draw an extra card to replace this.
Which is absolutely insane. And like we mentioned, Dovin's Veto, we have Mystical Disputes. We have a lot of different answers.
Even just original negate. You just get to say no to some of the Control players. Force of Negation gets brought in against a lot of Control decks by decks that may not be playing a lot of non-creature spells, but are playing blue cards. And
which, can be pretty powerful.
It's a free counter spell on your turn. I can counter your Teferi. I can counter your Wrath.
That's the thing, is there's quite a few different things you can do. Since we've covered most of the cycle, might as well talk about the Black Thoughtseize on a body.
Good old Grief.
Yeah.
Good Grief.
So Grief is, we already covered Thoughtseize.
2 black.
When it enters the battlefield, actually, probably tell you what Grief's CMC is.
4 mana, it's 2 black. It's a 3/2 with Menace. And when it enters the battlefield, you look at target opponent's hand specifically, and you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card. Again, you can exile a black card from your hand to evoke this.
Yeah, which is so strong, especially if you are like, for example, the one deck that I can really think of in Modern that plays it in main board is just Living End, or Blue Living End, whatever you want to call it.
Because Living End wants to cascade to something that costs less than 3, they can't afford to play Thoughtseize because they would hit it off their cascade spells. But because this costs 4, but you can play it for free, you kind of work your way around the downside of not being able to play Thoughtseize.
The best part is it comes back if you play Living End.
You also can't negate this.
Nope. This one can't be negated, and you don't lose 2 life. Sure, you lose a card if you play it for free, but you don't lose 2 life.
Comes back later, you take the Wrath out of their hand that was going to stop you. You have a 3/2 Menace that's going to kill them now. It's huge.
It's very powerful. And we did kind of cover it earlier, but the other card would be Force of Negation. Force of Negation against Control decks is very powerful. Sure, again, you lose a card in the process if you're not casting it on your turn. But
it's a tempo play.
It is.
It's just a tempo play. You're staying one step ahead of Control, and Control is always trying to get ahead from behind, as opposed to aggro, who's trying to stay ahead and never be behind.
I agree.
So,
absolutely,
keeping them at parity or behind still is a gigantic deal. To go with that, some blue decks are going to play Subtlety out of the sideboard. The blue incarnation, since we've covered most of that cycle, 2 blue for a flash flying 3/3. You can evoke it by exiling a blue card from your hand, and when it enters the battlefield, choose up to 1 target creature spell or planeswalker spell. Its owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. This is this reminds me of Memory Lapse, which is an old school counter spell. It's 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target spell, its opponent, instead of putting it into their graveyard, they put it on top of their library. It was easier to cast than counter spell, but it's in some ways like a time walk in certain cases. If I tapped out for 5 mana and you subtlety my 5 mana Teferi, it's okay. I basically spent my turn
doing nothing,
waiting till next turn to play this again.
Especially if you're a control deck where you were hoping to untap and keep up maybe counter spell, because that's legal in Modern. No, you get to get time walked instead. And of note, it's pretty strong again when you also blink it. If you've noticed, all these elementals that have an evoke cost, very strong if you can, blink them.
Because they have enter the battlefield effects, yeah.
Oh yeah, they do.
There's a whole bunch more cards we could talk about for sideboards, but I think we've covered some of the main categories. We've given you a general idea of how to approach certain decks. Control, you want to have interaction for their counter spells and make them stay further behind. With Burn, you want to be able to gain life and put bodies into play that block, give you time to stabilize. With Combo, you want to be able to interact with their combo pieces, whether in their deck, in their graveyard, in their hand, or just being able to counter their stuff. For graveyard decks, you want to be able to exile or shuffle away their graveyard.
And for like land cards or for land decks, you just want to either stop that land from doing anything or just get rid of it entirely.
Things with activated abilities, you just want to be able to shut off those activated abilities. The great part about having a sideboard is that you have these 15 cards to work with to say, okay, these are the things I'm the most scared of or I'm the weakest to. I'm going to hate on those because I can take out cards that are more generally good from my main board and replace them with cards that are phenomenal in this matchup, but I wouldn't bring in against, the negate I'm not going to bring in against the aggro matchup because I'm just going 1 for 1 and they're going to still be ahead.
Absolutely. So. And like you said, you just kind of want to cover the most, whatever you're weak against, you want most of your sideboard to be geared towards that. If it hurts you a little bit, that's fine as long as it cripples them. If they can't play the game and you can somewhat function, it's probably good enough to play unless there's better options.
A classic old one for us is playing Eldrazi Tron with Damping Sphere against Storm, because Tron can play around Damping Sphere. Storm cannot. Storm cannot win through that card. Win. So.
And sure, like your lands may have to tap normally now, but it's way better than them having to kill you on turn 3.
Correct.
And sort of like with E-Tron and regular Tron, it hurts them way more than it hurts you, because you can play fair. They cannot.
Well, that's the goal. Yeah. Let's move into our closing segment, Scoop Speed. Arven, do you have a story for us today?
I do. So this story kind of relates to when I first started playing Commander at our local LGS. And so I was told this is like somewhat of a competitive time on Fridays. So me being the great human being that I am, I put together Venser Shaper Savant stacks. It was basically CEDH.
Hey, Arven, for players who aren't familiar, what's a stack?
Yeah, so a stack is usually a bunch of artifacts or enchantments, any cards that hurt your opponent, say, for example, like Winter Orb, Static Orb.
Not allowing permanents to untap.
You can't draw cards, you can't play mana, or you can't pay mana to do stuff. Anytime you try to have fun, it says no.
Taxing you for playing the game of Magic.
Correct. And it's usually backed up by some counter spells of some sort if you're in blue to kind of mitigate everything else. And how it breaks parity is usually dependent in Commander. It's off of its commander or some of the other cards that just don't affect you. For example, I sat in a pod with, I did not know this at the time, but the other 3 players were fairly new players. And I played a bunch of islands because I'm one color. In turn 1, I play Island, Mana Crypt into a Back to Basics, which they're non-basic lands, don't untap. I was last in the turn rotation, and all 3 other players played a non-basic land that entered tapped.
It's like not playing a land on turn 1.
It's basically not... It did not feel good. I eventually proceeded to combo and kill and just lock the game out. The point is, I felt so bad. I went to one of our close friends, which I never do this, and I wanted to use Group Hug.
Mm-hmm.
Because I locked the game on turn 3 in the sense they couldn't draw cards, they couldn't tap mana, or they couldn't draw cards, they couldn't tap mana, they couldn't play creatures. The only thing they could do is legally draw a card, put a land into play tapped, and pass the turn. Yeah, that did not feel good.
No, I don't imagine it did.
And this was like my first time playing on Fridays at Commander, and people didn't like me very quickly, and then I grew away from that, sort of. And I played Group Hug for a little while.
There you go. Hey, I just want you to know you'll always be a monster to me.
Oh, thank you.
No, I mean, that's one of those things where, the communication is key. Someone communicated to you, oh, Fridays are a little more competitive, and then you happen to sit down in the pod that was like, oh, we didn't show up for this.
Yeah, no, it was a couple of precons, and it was a 5-color, like, good stuff deck that didn't have any basics, and I just locked that player out of the game on turn 1. Ooh, that
just feels really awful.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did. But it is what it is.
Good on you for switching over to Group Hug, letting them get to play the game of Magic for once, and you're still a Stacks player, but only when it's appropriate.
Of course. Yeah, well, now I have the whole turn 0. It's like, hey, what do we want to play? How powerful? At the time, I didn't do that.
No. This is a good way to bring up a reminder for all of you out there. This is a game.
Yes.
We love this game, and it is okay to play decks like Stacks. It is okay to play decks like Control, to play decks like Burn, to play combo decks. It is okay to play the game how you want to.
Absolutely.
But especially with Commander, with a social format like that, communicate with people. At the end of the day, it is a game, and what matters more are the relationships we build with each other, and everybody being able to say, I want to come back next week and play Magic again.
Absolutely.
Than comboing off and winning on turn 3 just because you can.
Absolutely. Like you said, it's a game. The point is to have fun, make friends. If you can win a few games, fantastic.
Yep.
If you can't, at least you showed up and have fun.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what I took away from that whole lesson.
Yeah. And you should be able to play Magic the way you want, but play it in the setting where it's appropriate to play the way you want. So, talking to people, I cannot tell you how many problems in this world would be solved if we would just talk to each other.
Would be nice, huh?
Yeah, sure would be. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel, The Mana Vault, on YouTube. I have been JC. This has been Arven.
Thank you so much for joining us.
We'll see you next time.